organized by St. Berkman's College. It's indeed a great pleasure to have you all among us today. I am Nina Abraham and I'm accompanied by my co-host Dan George. Over to you, Dan.
Well, good evening to all. Here are just a few guidelines that the participants are kindly requested to keep in mind to ensure the smooth conduct of today's program. All the questions that are intended for the Q&A sessions are to be posted in the chat box addressing it to everyone. A feedback form will be posted at the end of the webinar in the chat box of both Zoom and YouTube. E-certificates will be issued for the participants within a span of 3 days' time, and only if the certificates have not reached you after 3 days should the participants contact the organizing committee. And since all the personal details are to be entered in the feedback form, participants are humbly requested not to introduce yourself in the chat box, as this might distract the speaker. Well, these are just a few things to keep in mind. Thank you for listening. Over to you, Nina.
Thank you, Dan. Next, we have Assistant Professor, Mr. Nitin Varghese, who is here to welcome us all and introduce the speaker of the day. Over to you, sir.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. Dear Kim Reynolds, Professor Vijay Thomas, Head of the Department, Anish K. Joseph, Convener, my colleagues, and my dear participants, good afternoon to all. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the fourth webinar in this international webinar series organized by the Department of English, St. Berkman's College Changanacherry. Dear participants, I welcome each one of you to this webinar and I wish you all a very fruitful and productive webinar. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, our distinguished speaker today, Kimberley Reynolds, who is going to talk to us about Beneath the Big Top, Controversial Dimensions of Circus Stories. An honorary fellow of international research in children's literature, Kim is the professor of children's literature in the School of English Literature, Language and Linguistics at Newcastle University in the United Kingdom. Her research interests are children's literature studies, childhood studies, and modernism. She conceived and was the first director of the National Center for Research in Children's Literature and was involved in the United Kingdom's Children's Laureate and setting up 7 Stories, the National Center for Children's Books. In 2000, she was made the United Kingdom's 2nd Professor of Children's Literature. In 2013, she received the International Brothers Grimm Award for her contributions to the field of children's literature research. Then she is a past president of the International Research Society for Children's Literature and was the first senior honorary fellow of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the History of Emotions at the University of Western Australia. Currently, she is a senior editor of international research in children's literature. Then her remarkable and significant publications include children's literature in the Oxford University series of very short introductions, then Perceptions of Childhood, Understanding Alice, Left Out, the Forgotten Tradition of Radical Publishing for Children in Britain, 1910 to 1940, then Reading and Rebellion, an anthology of radical writing for children, 1900 to 1960s, and so on. On behalf of St. Berkman's College, on behalf of the English department and the entire organizing committee, I would like to extend a warm, fraternal, and hearty welcome to you, Kim. Thank you. Over to you, Kim.
Well, thank you very much. I was extremely flattered and happy to be asked to give this talk. And I've enjoyed working with my colleague Nitin as we've been preparing the program for you. And I hope that you'll all find it interesting. Before I begin the paper proper, Nitin and I thought it might be interesting for me to say a little bit about how children's literature has been emerging internationally as an area of research and teaching, because I have quite a lot of international experience over the years. And I'm quite a good measure, because when I was in your position, when I was a student, you could not study children's literature in any university in the United Kingdom. It was not considered a bona fide academic subject. There were no courses offered apart from in schools of education, but I was very stubborn and I really wanted to do research in this field. So I was lucky that at the University of Sussex, there was a child psychologist and an academic critic who were prepared to sponsor my doctoral research. And I finished my PhD on 19th century children's books, and there were no jobs in children's literature, no courses to teach. So I have had to help invent the field in this country, but now I can say that after 30 years, we have not only got many courses, including the kind of excellent survey course that you're doing now, which raises some very interesting questions about interfaces between childhood and children's literature, and so writing about children as well as writing for children. But we have had many kinds of intellectual turns in the discipline. We've been able to specialize and go deeper as more colleagues and students come on stream. So my own work became less general and is now very much in the what we might call the historical turn in children's literature research. So as Nitin said, my work combines an interest in modernism with an interest in children's literature and writing for children, particularly the politically left dimension of writing for children that was cancelled or written out of culture for a very long time. And so this has been an act of recovery and reinterpretation and seeing what happens when you re-examine the material and question the canon, and see that the canon is only a selection of texts that people have found or come across or remembered, but it is not a comprehensive picture. And so today, I think it's fair to say that we think of children's literature very much as an intersectional subject, not just in the way that it looks at different ethnicities, races, sexes, and so on, but it also is at the intersection of genres and periods and formats and modes, very much more so indeed than many other kinds of literature where, for instance, the visual dimensions of texts have been left out. And this has been of great interest in recent years to our research councils, as we've been trying to take academia out of universities and into the real world scenarios, working with museums, working with small businesses, working with archives. And it's been very rewarding to see that children's literature has become, well, we came top, we got the highest possible rating in the United Kingdom research assessment exercise my own university did for the kinds of impact research that we've been doing based on scholarship, but working with other communities. And I hope that you will find the same, that there are more opportunities for you, not just to research, but also to extend that research into the real world as scholars, not always as pedagogues. Anyway, the paper that I'm going to give today, this evening, is part of my recovery work, looking at a specific area of writing for children, and this is the Circus story. I'm working on a whole book project, and this talk is going to be a chapter in the book that's looking more broadly at, it'll be looking at children's bodies and seduction as they are represented in the Circus story. And the paper was originally intended to be both part of a chapter and for a conference in Poland that was canceled because of the virus. So it was nice for me when Nitin asked if I could give a talk to you, that I could use this paper, because I find when I'm writing a book, it helps me a great deal to present it and to get some feedback from people, and also some suggestions. As you will hear, the topic is an international one, but I'm sure that I do not know enough about the Circus story as it developed in India. So I will hope that in the feedback that you give on the session, you might recommend some books and materials that I could read and learn a bit more about the tradition as it has developed in India. Okay, so my topic, I'm going to put the presentation up now. So can I just check that you are able to see the presentation? Here it comes. It should be here. Is that all visible to you now?
Yes, visible.
Okay, okay. So as Nathan said, my title tonight is Beneath the Big Top, Controversial Dimensions of Circus Stories. Now, circus stories constitute a vast topic because the circus has been a consistently popular setting, theme, metaphor, and space in publishing for children from at least the 19th century, and writers, illustrators, and readers are attracted to it for a variety of reasons, which is why my book is going to have many chapters looking at different aspects. This is just a fragment of the kind of material that we have that falls under the heading of circus stories. So the new book is going to map the shifting cultural terrain across which circus stories move. It also takes into account that representations of the circus have never been the preserve of publications exclusively for the young. For instance, one of my central concerns in the larger project is the extent to which juvenile representations of the circus share aesthetic and political interests and strategies with modernist and avant-garde authors and artists. And I recently spoke about this at a similar kind of webinar in Coimbatore. And there's a YouTube link to that event if you find yourself interested in circus stories and want to know a bit more about the modernist tradition there. Anyway, the dual adult-child audience is a feature of circus stories everywhere. And thinking specifically of India, my research turned up a particular book that I find interesting, which is a book of photographs by Mary Ellen Mark called Indian Circus of 1993. And this is a typical example of the dual or double address of the circus story, because the book features child circus performers, but it's not for children. And in fact, the photographs were put together for a fine art exhibition that toured in several major cities at important galleries in the US. The shared audience for stories and images of circuses stems, at least in part, from the fact that circuses are hybrid spaces which mingle bodies, languages, sexualities, ethnicities, ages, classes, genres, discourses, animals and humans, the beautiful and the grotesque, high and low arts, eroticism, and glamour. This blurring of boundaries makes circus stories and circuses innately transgressive. And when you add to these characteristics the fact that, as a rule, circus folk, the people who work in circuses, tend to be perceived as cultural outliers who have a relaxed attitude to laws and norms, there's clearly potential for circuses to be regarded as controversial. Given this mixture of attributes and associations, there is much about circuses that goes against what is usually regarded as appropriate for children. Yet circuses are almost unfailingly regarded as suitable settings for stories aimed at even very young children. So in this talk, I'm exploring the extent to which circus stories may confront, but also disguise, erase, and make acceptable ways of treating children that are damaging and disturbing. Despite their diversity, circus stories need to be understood as constituting a distinct genre with a clear set of conventions. For instance, the action almost invariably begins with the arrival of the circus in a town, village, or city, and focuses on the circus's impact on a local child or group of children. The first form of impact is the way a circus vanquishes the tedium, restrictions, and in some cases, the privations of childhood. From the bright posters announcing that a circus is coming, to the circus parade and culminating in performances under the big top, the quotidian world becomes secondary. The circus is also intrinsically exotic, international, polyglot, and carnivalesque. This is because of all that mingling and blurring of boundaries that I mentioned before. And in children's books about circuses, more important than the exotic animals, the astonishing illusions, the gravity-defying aerialists and acrobats, and antic behavior of adults in the roles of clowns are the juvenile performers. These apparently exceptional versions of children's and young people who are presented to audiences as important parts of the circus family arouse a complex mixture of desires and emotions, which give rise to another staple of the genre, stories about children who run away to join the circus. But what happens to those who succeed in being taken into the circus is rarely what they expect. My focus today relates to the seductive aspect of circuses, that desire that makes children want to run away and join them, and also the way child bodies are acquired, disciplined, used, and displayed across a selection of circus stories. The distinguished social and cultural historian Carolyn Steedman has identified the most referred to, represented, and transmogrified child figure of the 19th century as Mignon, the girl acrobat who features in Book 1 of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister of 1795-6. Indeed, Steedman suggests that the androgynous 13-year-old acrobat haunted the 19th century. Although part of a traveling troupe of acrobats rather than a fully fledged circus, Mignon's fascinating body, history, and the suffering she endures at the hands of her trainers underpinned campaigns in the real world to protect child circus artists and other child performers. Apart from the sentiments aroused by Mignon, one reason why Victorian reformers concentrated on rescuing circus children was the recognition that such children were especially vulnerable, since the peripatetic nature of circuses meant that little was known about their origins and living conditions. And even if concerns were raised about a child, it was difficult to trace and rescue them. Particular anxiety centered on juvenile circus acrobats because of the harsh training regimes used to turn an ordinary child's body into something extraordinary. These were detailed in studies and exposés such as Ellen Barley's Pantomime Waifs of 1884, which explains that training began very young because then alone, before their bones and muscles have attained firmness and strength, before the frame is knit, can the bones be rendered sufficiently supple to perform the duties required of them. And I think you can see in this Swedish painting of a child acrobat the extent to which their bodies are really only valued as performance vehicles. This child is little more than an animal being displayed to a circus master to see if there might be worth some money. The child itself is not valued or protected. The reforming journalist Henry Mayhew, known for his 1851 survey of the working population of London, was another who provided detailed descriptions of the training endured by juvenile acrobats, helping to make the campaign one of interest across the whole of British society. The Acrobats Bill was brought before the British Parliament in 1872. When presenting the bill, Lord Shaftesbury read from a letter by a 17-year-old acrobat whose training began when he was 2. My father, he writes, trained me into it. He began by twisting my limbs and backbone when I was a little baby. I used to suffer dreadful, and I remember when I was from 4 to 9 years of age, he used to make me twist myself and remain twisted up till my bones seemed to come away from each other, and I was often ill from the pain. That bill was unsuccessful, but the campaign continued and finally succeeded in 1879. is against this backdrop, this campaign to protect acrobat children, that we must read such books as The Little Acrobat and His Mother of 1872, in which a harsh mother subjects her son to just such a routine and also deprives the boy of food to keep his body weight low. And that's another characteristic that stretches across the circus story and real circus lives over the centuries. There were many other books like this, including Acrobat's Girlhood of 1889 by the best-selling author Hesba Stretton, Frances Stratton's Nan the Circus Girl of 1898, and a pair of books each called The Runaways by Mrs. O.F. Walton of 1873 and Sidney Gray's The Runaways of 1884. These books all feature children who, like Mignon, are trapped in abusive regimes as circus performers. In them, the circus is a place of cruelty and abuse, and far from running away to the circus, the children flee from them. And I think that's an important point, that the early stories, right through to the beginning of the very early 20th century, are places where children are abducted and trapped into circuses, not where children run away to. But there comes a moment when the circus is presented as such an attractive and enticing place that that desire to join the circus becomes very widespread. But that's a 20th century phenomenon. Sidney Gray's book, The Runaways, you can see it has a very pretty decorative color on the left-hand side of the screen there. This book is a typical circus story for the 19th century, and as part of an attractive but very inexpensive series published by the Religious Tract Society, it was intended to reach out to mass audiences. The Runaways tells of brother and sister Jack and Mags, known to the circus-going public as Giacomo and Mademoiselle Marguerite. Despite their exotic names, they are emphatically identified as British. Their late mother, who made costumes for the circus, came from Glasgow, so she was Scottish. Their father was English. While a great many circus children were in fact abducted from other countries, local prejudice was inclined to construct foreign children as knowing and sexually precocious, and so less in need of aid than British children. Jack's and Mag's Britishness then is used as a marker of their purity and a vehicle for arousing sympathy for them, and by extension for real children in similar situations, wherever they come from. For the same reason, and in keeping with the Religious Tract Society ethos, in this book it is made clear that their education has been as neglected as all their other needs. The children are illiterate, but instinctively devout. Before her death, their mother taught them a few hymns and prayers, which they recall on the night they decide to run away. They assure each other that the God their mother believed in loves them and will look after them when they leave the circus behind. Finally, with a view to enlisting help for the campaign to rescue circus children, the pair are shown to be helpless. They have no protector or guide and are entirely at the mercy of tyrannical and abusive adults. Jack, for instance, is brutally beaten by the circus owner most days. The children finally decide to run away when the owner kicks and fatally injures their small dog, the last link to their mother. Running away is the extent of their agency, however. In these books, circus children are always victims who must be rescued by middle-class philanthropists, just as Mignon is rescued by Wilhelm Meister. Mags and Jack's saviors come in the form of a wealthy family whose house they chance upon as they tramp towards London in the hope of finding work. The wealthy family had been to see the circus when it visited their town, and they recognized the children. They see them, though, as Giacomo and Mademoiselle Marguerite. They don't understand at first why they are on the tramp. When the reality of the lives behind the gaily dressed young performers they had applauded, and in some cases envied. So, for instance, the daughter of this household, is disabled, and she had longed to be a performer like Mademoiselle Marguerite, not understanding the kind of life that Mags lives. So when they understand about their lives, they and the readers are encouraged to question their own complicity in what has happened to the children. They are complicit by becoming audiences, spectators, and applauding these children. The wealthy household takes the children in, begins their education, and helps the children make contact with a long-lost uncle in Scotland. The uncle and his wife are childless and happily welcome the children to their home. Since this had been the dying mother's wish, it's a solidly happy ending. There are many similarities between these British circus stories and the approach to the genre in the United States. The best-known American circus story of the 19th century was James Otis Taylor's Toby Tyler, or 10 Weeks with the Circus of 1881. Taylor cornered the US market in circus stories, writing a total of 7 between 1880 and 1911. Of these, Toby Tyler was far and away the most successful. It was reprinted 7 times in Taylor's lifetime and several times since. It reached new audiences through a Disney adaptation in 1960. As well as following genre conventions, Taylor added to them, starting with details of how the young Toby is enticed to join the circus by false promises. An orphan, Toby is being raised by an uncle who mistreats and overworks him. The boy is entrapped by Mr. Lord, who has a stall in the circus selling sweets. He promises the hungry little boy he will be able to eat some of the treats he would be selling if he joins the circus and works for Mr. Lord. Toby soon discovers that life in the circus is even harder than it was on his uncle's farm. Mr. Lord thrashes him every morning before breakfast, and when the circus manager decides Toby should become a bareback rider, performing dangerous stunts on horses, his training is as brutal as those for child acrobats in British circus stories. Like Jack and Mags, he decides to escape. With nowhere else to go, he runs back to his uncle. Things turn out well for Toby because his absence has worked a transformation on Uncle Daniel. Toby is now loved and safe, giving the story a very American twist. Having applied himself to circus work and learned new skills, Toby is now strong, independent, and successful. So kind of American success story. Needless to say, the happy ending, not the brutal reality of circus life, sets the tone for the Disney version of this story. The Disney film was a lively, cheerful production in which the circus is largely a place of delight and achievement. Disney had already had success with another circus-based animated cartoon based on a children's book, Dumbo. That was in 1941. And this seems to me to be the turning point in the presentation of circuses. So instead of being brutal places that children need to flee, they are presented in what I think of as a rather dangerously attractive and jolly place for all the family. Nevertheless, it's notable that the happy endings in the earlier stories always involve escaping from rather than running away to circuses. This is true of a significant proportion of the first circus stories, though much is made of the beatings and regimes that make children so desperate. Questions must also be asked about what is not said, as the children's bodies are made to fulfill the demands of the adults who control them. Now, this silence may at first have been because the sexual abuse of children was not something that featured in the public consciousness. The term pedophile was only first used in 1900. The fact remains, however, that child performers of the kind featured in circus stories fell outside the usual forms of vigilance. And arguably, this remains the case for child performers today. In our own time, there are many stories of young athletes, gymnasts, skaters, and dancers who are sexually abused by the trainers who control their bodies and careers and ought to be looking after and protecting them. While the terminology, the term pedophile, may have been lacking, the phenomenon of predatory adult interest in child bodies was not unknown. The early days of circus stories coincided with the rise of spectators who were sexually aroused by watching child acrobats and other juvenile performers. Steedman calls the late 19th century the age of the connoisseur for acrobats and aerialists. These fans generated an aestheticized physiology around the performers' bodies. Children were particularly vulnerable to being preyed upon by those who paid to watch them, and sometimes paid more for time alone with the objects of their fascination and desire. Against this real-life backdrop, even the simplest, most cheerful seeming circus story can be seen as controversial and dark. Look, for instance, at Circus Time this is by an unknown, to me at least, author-illustrator called Maury. Now, the only version of this I can find is this 1964 one printed in London. But from the clothes and the style of the illustrations, I'm pretty sure that this was imported and translated from some part of Europe, probably Eastern Europe. Now let's just look at this story. Here we have the arrival of the circus to a little village, and we have the happy seeming circus parade with the elephants, the exotic animals, the glamorous female, and this happy hearing little boy performing for the circus parade, enticing people to come to the circus. Now, the central characters are these two children, but as you can see from their patched and ragged clothes, they're too poor to be able to afford a ticket for the circus. They're orphans, they have no one to look after them. And so it seems a kind of kindness when Bimbo the clown, who is also the director and manager of the circus, approaches them and says he will make it possible for them to go to the circus. And not only that, he will give them fine new clothes and show them behind the scenes of the circus world. So they're being introduced to the kind of background of the circus. That night they go to watch the circus performance, and they think this is a marvelous world. They love the crazy clowns, they love the performing animals, but most of all, they're delighted by the beautiful little girl, Mary, who seems to be almost the same age as they are. They think she is very special indeed. But of course, after this delightful episode, the circus will leave town and go on its way, and the children will have to give back their pretty clothes. Or do they? Look, here's Bimbo the clown, and he says, do you know, children, if you want to keep your clothes, you can come with us and travel with the circus. This is presented as a happy ending. This is the way the circus can absorb these children and give them a career, give them training, and make them part of a circus family. And maybe it will be happy, but given what we've seen already about the way the circus seduces children and then treats them very harshly, we have to ask ourselves, is this really a marvelous Cinderella tale about kind circus folk who rescue neglected children and give them exciting lives? Or knowing the fate of so many fictional circus children, and of course real life children, are the problems of this pair about to become even greater? It's not necessary to read the story as one of entrapment and grooming, but once you do, it becomes controversial in several ways, since there is no sense in which this is offered as a cautionary tale. The story doesn't invite you to see the dangerous side of joining the circus. It only offers it as a place of delight and of refuge for the children. Readers are encouraged to feel happy for Jack and Susan, and perhaps even to envy them, to think, I wish I could join the circus. I wish I could be a special child like they are going to be. This is the kind of story that feeds dreams of running away to join the circus, promising child readers that if they do, or they become another kind of performing child, they could become glamorous, exceptional, and enviable. Arguably, then, such stories participated in the procurement of vulnerable children, or at least the tendency for spectators to assume complacently that the smiling performers are having a splendid time, when the reality may be very different. The same issues persist throughout the 20th century, including in nonfiction works, which purport to document the life of child circus stars. For example, Jill Krementz's A Very Young Circus Flyer. This is part of a series about exceptional children. This book came out in 1979, and it's made up of photos and interviews with a real circus family, the Farfan family. The acknowledgement reads, "What an admirable family, and how proud I am to know them." And they are admirable in the sense that they are a hardworking, loving family. There is no indication that Tato, the boy on the front cover, he's the book's 9-year-old central character, there's no indication that he's being physically or sexually abused by his parents or other members of the circus, at least not seriously. His ambition and commitment to learning the family trade seem genuine and are impressive. But what else can he do? There is much in the text that is disturbing at the level of the opportunities and choices available to Tato, the impact on his body, the way he's trained to dress up, display his body in what might be considered provocative ways, and how far his rights to education, safety, and the kind of childhood freedom of his non-circus peers are being respected. This is the story or a documentary about a child for whom the circus is home, school, and playground. One of the first things we learn about Tato is that he comes from a long line of circus performers. In this case, his father's family came from a circus in Chile and his mother from Czechoslovakia. From birth, his destiny has been to be a circus performer. And so, as part of a traveling circus, he's one of those children who flies beneath the radar. It's very difficult for officials to track and check whether he is healthy, whether he's getting an education, whether he has choices and care in his life. He's been flying, that means going on the trapeze, since he was 4 years old, and his 5-year-old cousin is soon to make her debut. Although mention is made of doing homework, because they're always on the road, we're told that the family travels about 15,000 miles a year, and last year they visited 52 cities. There's little in the way of formal, systematic education. And when the daily routine is set out, schooling is never mentioned, and there seems to be no time when it could actually take place. Many of the things that concerned 19th century activists about what circus training required of child bodies also apply to this boy. Unlike most children, he's not pleased when he is measured for new costumes and discovers that he has grown because my dad is hoping I'll stay small to make it easier to catch me. He rarely gets to watch the other acts as he's required to do long hours of training. In the season, they train in the morning, do 2 shows a day, and then spend 2 hours training after the evening performance. In the off season, we just have to rehearse from 9 to 5, and then we're free. So only from 9 to 5, a day's work. It's about the only time we get to go out at night and do things, because after the season starts, we have so many evening shows. Although the book makes little of the rigors of the training regime, the child, Tato, casually remarks that his father gets very angry when Tato makes mistakes or has to be told repeatedly what to do, and that I have marks all over my hands where Papi, his father, catches me, but can't hold on because my wrists are too loose. Compared with the circus children in 19th century novels, Tato has a reasonable life, and he seems proud and happy to be a member of the circus. Nevertheless, as with Maurice Circus Time, in Krementz's book, the circus setting makes what is in fact a very hardworking, in many ways a limiting life, seem glamorous and attractive. So again, it's seductive. Mignon's hold over the 19th century imagination wasn't solely to do with her vulnerability and pathos. Goethe's account of Wilhelm Meister's attraction to Mignon is undeniably bound up with the exotic and erotic fascination of being allowed to gaze on her body in public performances, where she does what he is incapable of imagining a body can do. This is a quote. Wilhelm could not look at her enough. His eyes and his heart were irresistibly fascinated by the mysterious condition of this being. He kept on looking at her. A century and a half later, the founder of post-colonial studies, Edward Said, then between ages 9 and 10 and living in Egypt, recalls being similarly drawn to the pages in Collins' Junior Book of Knowledge showing Kalita, a girl fakir in the Bertram Mills Circus. In his memoir, Said describes how Kalita's contortions were captured in tiny, grainy, and blurred photographs. He was intrigued by her unfamiliar two-piece costume, but particularly struck by, and this is a quote, the amazing, unimaginable things she did with her body. Kalita's behavior defied the laws of respectability and decency in 1940s Cairo and many other parts of the world for most boys and girls. Her exploits, including wearing a bathing suit and carrying a fearsome-looking crocodile, excited him. He, this is a quote again, dreamed of knowing her, of being taken into her caravan. Another quote, of being shown more feats. Just as much as if he were watching in the circus ring, the young Said is allowed to gaze on the body of another child whose life is exceptional enough to be included in a children's encyclopedia, but whose deportment and assumed experience are only acceptable in the circus context. The same is true of Tato, the child trapeze artist. The text reports the kinds of knowledge which he has, like Kalita's costumes, which would be considered unsuitable for most 9-year-olds. His parents dressed themselves and their children in the revealing costumes associated with acrobats and aerialists and dancers and other performers. He wears hairspray and makeup, and the only cultural reference he seems to have outside the circus is Burt Lancaster kissing Gina Lollobrigida in the movie Trapeze. So he doesn't know anything else about art or books or literature or theater, but he knows about this rather sexy romantic film. On his evenings off in the winter training camp, Tato plays arcade games, especially pinball machines, and his brother, who's just 5 years older, rides a motorcycle and hangs out with the showgirls. So they're kind of precociously knowing about the adult world. But there isn't much time for these distractions because they are the other tasks that come with being a professional. Photo shoots, interviews, fan mail, and queuing with the adults to collect his weekly paycheck. It's not just when they're paid that Tato's life overlaps with those of the grown-ups around him. He has no separate world of childhood and finds his friends among the caged animals. Since the turn of the millennium, so now we're in the 21st century, there's been a wave of circus novels, many of them built around elaborate fantasy worlds. And you might find this strange. The circus is a really old-fashioned format in many ways, but we're having lots of novels that feature circuses, and many of them feature circuses that are drawing on things like old-fashioned magic or artificial intelligence or augmented reality. These new circus novels also normalize and glamorize childhoods that are far from what most of us would consider ideal. So my final example tonight comes from Erin Morgenstern's crossover novel, The Night Circus of 2011. The plot centers on a contest set up by two rival magicians. Now, these magicians, we're supposed to understand, do real magic rather than simple illusions. The contest is between two children that they adopt, Celia and Marco. Celia and Marco are trained for a competition for several years, the competition between the adult magicians. And though they learn to do astonishing things, The training is isolating and brutal. Marco, for instance, is locked in his room for months on end to read and study. He never sees another soul. Meals are delivered to his door, but he rarely speaks with anybody. And when his master does take him out, it is always and only for educational purposes. Celia is, in fact, the illegitimate daughter of her master. He never refers to himself as her father, but he shows her no affection. Indeed, both children are seriously abused, starting with the moment when each is bound to their master magician by a ring that painfully burns through their skin, leaving a vivid scar. Celia's talent lies in breaking and repairing things, and so her father repeatedly breaks her bones and systematically harms her in other ways to teach her how to mend living bodies. Here, for instance, is a scene from early on in the book. Prospero the enchanter uses a pocket knife to slit his daughter's fingertips open one by one, watching wordlessly as she cried out until calm enough to heal them, drips of blood slowly creeping backwards. Celia's shoulders fall, releasing the tension that is knotted in them, her relief palpable as she draws herself safely together. Her father gives her only moments to rest before slicing each of her newly healed fingers again. Despite these distressing scenes, the book's paratext includes a great many quotations from reviewers deeming the book enchanting and crediting it with bringing happiness. It is as if, in the interests of making them ready to perform in the night circus, it is legitimate to treat these children cruelly. As long as the show goes on, it seems not to matter what happens under the big top when audiences are not looking. And so, while circus stories have never been classified as controversial, I think it's time to consider whether at least some of them should be. Certainly, it seems that we need to look more closely at how the lives of children who fascinate and thrill the paying public are presented to child readers. And that's the end of my talk and of my presentation.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll now move on to our question and answer section. Me and Dan will be simultaneously reading the questions from Zoom and YouTube platform. So we have the first question from our professor, Vimal sir. So you can go ahead.
Yeah. Hello, Professor Kimberley. Thank you for that talk. And the abuse and the exploitation of children it's very rampant. It's very unfortunate. But my question kind of goes in the other direction. My question is about the question of agency and legal and political rights that children might have, or perhaps even the lack thereof. Because when we think about it, even legal rights, it seems like legal rights are filtered down and made available to children through a gatekeeping mechanism of adult legislation, and how adults imagine the problems of childhood to be, what they imagine childhood to be, right? Which includes naturally decisions taken in the best interests of children.
You would hope.
So, would you consider this to be a corollary of the development of the idea of the modern nation state and its ensuing legislations? I say this because there are many societies elsewhere, including in Greece and many countries in Southeast Asia, which have very different frameworks for understanding adolescent agency. In other words, one thing more. In other words, what is your opinion on the idea of children's rights interpreted, in the context of legalities, such as, very controversially ideas such as the statutory rape? I'm thinking about things, texts like Nabokov's Lolita. So, is this an idea of childhood that is constructed and that can undermine, a young adult's agency in that sense?
I think this is a huge topic and a very interesting question. And you're right, of course, that many different countries have different attitudes to what is a child's right, to whom a child belongs. I know in Africa, for instance, there's a tradition in certain countries of seeing children as possessed, and we have child murders based on this in ways that would not be appropriate or be inconceivable in other countries. There has been, as you will well know, a global attempt through the United Nations to define the rights of the child. There's a United Nations Charter for the rights of the child, but that charter was largely drawn up by Western and European countries, and it doesn't fit comfortably in every culture. Nevertheless, it's assumed that these should be rights of children, and I think that most of us, when we look at children, we nurture the hope and belief that children should be protected by adults, and that legislation is the mechanism that should protect them. So the problem for, one of the problems about children who are performers in a kind of arena like a circus where they never stay in one place for a long time is that it's very hard for the legal authorities to track and trace them. And this means that they are often overlooked and neglected. But you're right, it's a problem that's ongoing, and certain kinds of rituals, for instance, female genital mutilation, these are culturally enshrined and very difficult to, it's hard for people outside of one culture to understand that in another culture, this is perceived as doing something beneficial to a child, at least by some of the adults. So it's a very complicated situation, and one set of laws is unlikely to be appropriate in every circumstance, in every culture. But I think there is a kind of global desire to give children childhoods that include safety, education, and happiness. And children's literature is one way in which a child can get a sense that this is something that is an expectation if they don't have it in the culture around them.
Yeah, could I have your opinion on a text like Lolita, for example?
Well,
how do you evaluate something like Lolita?
Lolita is a really interesting example because it's about a child and it's a construction of childhood, but not for a juvenile audience at all. And yet it does seem to suggest that Lolita is a knowing and complicit child. I don't know if you've come across, there's a very fascinating book by the art critic called Anne Higgnet, Higgonet. And she looked at the construction of childhood in art and culture from the 18th century to the present, and she divides them into the two categories of innocent child who deserves protection and knowing child who is somehow available and complicit. And I think that's where we have problems with a book like Lolita. It's a marvelous piece of art, but not a particularly safe kind of way of constructing childhood if you want to protect a child. I don't know, I would be interested in what you think. Where would you place Lolita?
Yeah, I think the question of consent is a huge problem, and it's not something that we can easily arrive at, So I'm not sure if having an overarching mechanism for identifying what is best for all children is the right answer, or doing away with this idea altogether might be even more dangerous. So
well,
I'm not
I
sure.
think, in fact, you remind me of another problem, which is that the law is not applied consistently. So even say in a place like the United States, which says that it does support and agree with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the police operate a system which is called innocence profiling, wherein they would treat children of Latino or Black, African, or West Indian backgrounds as different from white children, seeing the white children as more innocent, more vulnerable, more childlike than the other children who they see as more experienced and knowing in the ways of the world. So it's not consistently applied. It's an illusion rather than a reality, I think.
All right, thank you so much for your thoughts.
Good question.
Thanks, sir. Ma'am, since you had asked for a response, several of our participants have been kind enough to provide a response. Shall I read it to you? Read a few of them.
Yes, please. Yes.
This is from Kripa. She has said, in India, I feel that literature and discourses are focused on the skills of the circus people, including children of circus and the carnivalesque atmosphere. Poverty is depicted, of course, but the abuse of women and children are often ignored. The presentation of female bodies to excite the sexual fantasies of men is there only in undertones. There are no serious depictions of the real controlling and abusive scenario behind the curtains to provide enough caution. In most narratives, we see owners taking in orphans and runaways as if it is a kind act. As you mentioned, the smokes and mirrors of a happy ending and escape to Wonderland is the general and major representation. Also, I would like to add that childhood education in India is approved to be very strict. Conventionally, it is only normal to punish children physically and to deny them freedom. I guess this could be the reason for the normalization of violent training given to children in the circus as well.
Those are two really interesting points to me, and I thank you for that comment. I really like the idea of the smokes and mirrors which disguise the reality of what's going on. But I'm interested to understand that the education system is such a disciplinarian one. I was not aware of that, and so you see that as a kind of normalization. That will help me in some of the reading of texts that might be suggested to me.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next question is from Professor P.J. Thomas. His question is, how do you distinguish fantasy stories from circus stories? There's also a second part to it. Can you consider Alice in Wonderland series a circus story?
I don't consider Alice in Wonderland a circus story, although it has many. I can see exactly why you ask that, because it has many of the same characteristics, but it doesn't have the circus setting. And that's a crucial part of my definition. It has to be set in a circus with the big top and all of the conventions that go with it. But there is no borderline between the fantasy and the circus story for me, in the sense that many circus stories are fantasies. They're not always presented in that way. So for instance, recently there's been a circus novel that has come out of Ireland, which is very much set in the real world and looks at disability and how skills can give children who are misfits a place in the social world. And that's a very realistic novel, whereas something like The Night Circus is a fully fledged fantasy novel. Nevertheless, it's a circus story because it has all the genre conventions of the circus story. And I would say there is a very close affinity between the fantasy story and the circus story.
Well, thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Bibin Thomas. He has asked, colonial narratives usually consider Black bodies as sites of exoticism and wonder, two motives that are essentially part of circus. But in the stories that you discuss, the child bodies that are protagonists are mostly white. How do you approach this dichotomy?
I don't think it is as much of a dichotomy as it might have looked from the examples that I gave. There are quite a lot of illustrations in which the children are not always, their racial profile or background is not always mentioned. We don't know where they come from. And if they're in picture books, they are sometimes peculiar colors like green or red, so that you have no sense of what racial or ethnic background these characters are. But I think that the very fact of belonging to circus, this is one of the genre conventions, sets the child, whatever its color, outside the normal and makes them exotic. And that is associated with being perhaps mixed race or of a different color than perhaps the reader of the book in the West.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next question is from Parvati S. Nair. There's always a cultural aspect as well to take into account about how people view the brutal training the circus children go through. For example, even today, there's a great amount of controversy revolving around China's training camps for young athletes, where they go through rigorous training to compete in various tournaments. This training is seen as normal, and in movies, it's even lauded. The parents themselves have no problem in leaving their kids in these camps. The training, despite its controversial nature, is generally seen as necessary. In most circus stories, people tend to look at it as a training in them as their way of life and as their reality, and something we have no business interfering in. In this case, without the in circus perspective, people just see it as their normal. What is your opinion on this?
I think this is a part of the chapter that I really want to develop, because you're right, this is a phenomenon that extends beyond the circus, but the circus almost acts as a kind of metaphor for all those other kinds of training where children are selected as being specially able. China is one place, but it happens everywhere. You see it in the Soviet Union, you see it in the United States, you see it in Britain. I don't know about India, but I would not be surprised that when the child has a trainer and people are investing in that training and seeing this as an elite child in some way because of the special kind of performance, it's as if the child's body no longer belongs to that child, and that the trainer, the manager, has control over it. And that possession there's a kind of curious confusion between what's appropriate, what's love, what's discipline, what's training. And I think often, for instance, with the gymnasts that I showed, they have been so trusting, and they've put their bodies so completely in the hands of these people who tell them what to eat, how to exercise, how to be the best, that when inappropriate things are done to them, they're quite confused about whether this is still in their best interests. And it takes quite a lot of courage and a certain amount of growing up in knowledge before they can begin to draw the line between what is appropriate and not. And that is where vigilance from the outside is really important. That's why I was trying to make the point, though I didn't dwell on it, that audiences and those of us who cheer on performers, child athletes, child dancers, if we applaud them and don't look behind the scenes at what's happening to them, we are complicit in the kinds of experiences that they are having, including the abusive ones.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Kumarasan P. He has asked, is there a difference between children literature for adults and children literature for children? Or is it only a matter of perception, adults and children looking at the same text differently?
These are marvelous questions. I would like to think about them all more, but this is something I have thought about quite a lot. I think a good children's book is never only for children. A good children's book can be read at any point in your life, and it can be appreciated by adults who never even read it as a child. Or a badly written children's book, or a book that only succeeds in addressing children and you outgrow it, is usually it's not good art, it's not good literature. Children's literature ought to be laying the foundation from which you can move on to adult literature. But as in everything else, sometimes, when you're a child, you want sweet things and things that you outgrow, and sometimes you just need relaxing reads. So an example I'm sure most of you are familiar with is Enid Blyton. I know she had quite a following for a long time in India. Now, I would see her as a writer who is really a writer just for children. When you come back and read her as a grown-up, you can see that her stories, her plots are very formulaic, they're very thin, the characterization is not terribly good. And yet children can find a great deal in Enid Blyton, and she can be the kind of writer who gives them stamina. It's not good literature, but it's good storytelling. and it's good preparation for creating enthusiastic readers. So there is that kind of difference, that, you know, a not very good literary writer like Enid Blyton can be good for you when you're younger, as long as you don't get stuck there. But in the end, a good piece of children's writing is like any other good piece of art. It should grow and change and mature with you as you grow up.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next question is from Kavya Vijay. Many animals are exploited in the circus in the name of training and all. While raising voice on the suppressions faced by humans, animals too need consideration in circus stories. Your opinion, please.
I completely agree with you. And I think that the children and animals in circus stories are almost always treated similarly. The children are really a kind of animal in the circus story, but an animal who has, nowadays in many countries, it's not legal to have animal performers anymore, but it is still legal to have child performers. And if you read as many circus stories as I have done, you will find that very often the child characters, their best friends are animals, circus animals, because they have nobody else their own age or nobody else they can trust. And similarly, the animals depend on the child characters for love and comfort and treats and sometimes escape. So I think the animals and the children are very much in the same kind of space of the circus, the same level and hierarchy.
Ma'am, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Dan.
I'm sorry, my net connection just went. I hope I didn't lag. The next question is from Professor PJ Thomas. He's asked, in hard times, circus is posited as opposite to factual education. Circus is for making children imaginative and giving them delight. Do you think it's an apolitical presentation? Isn't it interesting?
Hard Times, as you can imagine, will be a very important book in my bigger project. And I will be talking about the positive sides of circus as well as this dark side that I've been talking about today. So, for instance, when I was looking at the modernist and avant-garde art, I was looking at the way that the circus can be used to critique fascism and the political repression of the early 20th century. Now here, I think we have a lot of circus books that take their cue from Dickens and do see the circus as a place of imagination, an antidote to a world in which technology or kind of the tunneling, the constraints on life. You know, we all close doors as we grow up, and we make ourselves smaller, less open to certain ways of thinking. And the circus is the kind of antidote to that throws it all open and tries to get you to think about the mysteries of the world again, and the potentiality of doing the impossible or gravity defying, and the blessings of humor and comedy. All of these things are there in some circus stories as well. But I think that sometimes, and I think we could see this in Dickens as well, while the circus is a place of vitality, creativity, less regimentation, you don't know how safe the life of a child like Sissy Jupe is in the circus. You have to think again about why so many people were worried about the actual lives of real living child performers, not just the metaphoric use of the circus in that book. But yes, I'm very happy to celebrate the delightful side of the circus, and that will be several chapters in the book will do that as well.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next question is from Riya Ajit. Ma'am, circus stories celebrate the capabilities and capacities of body, giving a sense of wonder and awe in the mind of children as readers. In such a case, ma'am, can you talk about the psychological repercussions that affect children's mind as readers, as they may read inspiring stories, yet providing a false sense of security?
That's a complicated question, and your voice was faded out a little bit, but I think I got the gist of it. So this is a question about whether the sense of awe and wonder and the spectacular can give child readers or spectators a false sense of security. Is that right?
Ma'am, should I repeat it?
Yes, I didn't hear the full question.
Ma'am, circus stories celebrate the capabilities and capacities of a body, giving a sense of wonder and awe in the minds of children as readers. In such a case, ma'am, could you talk about the psychological repercussions that affect child's mind as readers, as they may read inspiring stories, yet providing a false sense of security?
Right. I think what we're trying to get at in this question is the question I've been asking myself while I was thinking about the controversial nature of the circus story, that it can make you think of all the positive and extraordinary competencies and skills of these children, and create a sense of admiration for them, like little Tato, who is the circus flyer. That child is a really good artist, a professional in many ways. And if you decide that you want to be like that child, what you don't know is, or what is underplayed is how much you would have to give up. So any child who did decide to join the circus in that way probably would discover that there were lasting kind of scars and repercussions, because the imagined childhood and the imagined glamour and excitement is not what the reality is. I hope I've answered that question. It was a complicated but interesting one.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is from Professor Cindy Rachel. She has asked, don't you think at the idea of joining a circus was that of a glorified existence? There were circus families. There were people who joined due to their immense fascination for carnival. From this fascination and glorification and the desire to carry on a living for circus family is able only to nurture circus further. When did this break begin? The fracture between a glorious magical existence and a saga of torture, force, and rape.
Well, I think it's almost, I don't know that it ever fractured in quite that way. I think there's always been the delight, the pleasure, and so on for the spectator. And what we need to do is to look behind the curtains to see the dark side. And so I think that began to happen with, Goethe in the 18th century. These stories, as long as people started to question the reality of the lives of the children, then you had the double vision. The spectators enjoyed the spectacle, but then the campaigners and activists tried to say, this is not a healthy spectacle. It's a perverted one because it's damaging the people who are doing the performance. So I think you could say that it began to fracture as early as the 18th century. But I think this question also has another side to it, which is a very interesting one, which is that focus on carnival, because yes, circus is certainly a form of carnival. And the thing about carnival is it must be temporary. Bakhtin's theory of carnival always says that it only is effective because it lasts a specified amount of time, whether it's over the period of a natural carnival or a religious festival or something similar. Now, the thing about the circus is it's a temporary visitation because the circus travels around. For the spectators, it's always temporary, but for the performers, it never ends. And so that's where the fracture comes, I think, is the difference between the perpetual, impossible carnival. Carnivalesque cannot be perpetual, but it is for the performers in that they can never escape that world, or they escape it only with difficulty. But for every group of spectators, it is just a carnivalesque moment when the circus arrives and performs. So that's where I would see the important factor.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next question is from Sneha M. How do you view the subversion of a traditional comic clown to evil clown? Also, please comment upon its impact on child psychology.
Was that, how do I view the impact of a clown? What's that? I couldn't hear it again.
Child psychology. Please comment upon its impact on child psychology. How do you view the subversion of a traditional comic clown to evil clown?
Well, I haven't yet done everything that I want to do on clowns, but clowns are again, they're interesting figures because you rarely have a child clown. They're almost always adults, but they behave like children, and they often feature as sinister characters, especially in the kinds of fantasies we were talking about before, where the clown has this painted on smile, but behind the smile, there's not just sadness, that's the pathos, but sometimes evil, sinister kind of thing. You might, in a popular manifestation, you would think of the Joker from Batman, who always looks to be laughing, but is actually doing dark things. And I think many children are suspicious. They're frightened by clown makeup or the mask of a clown. They recognize that that is an inhuman face, that they don't know how to read the emotions. And I don't know when it switches from being something that you suspect to something that makes you laugh and that you feel superior to, because that's the kind of antic humor of a clown is something that you feel they're behaving in an idiotic or a juvenile way. And so the spectator is put in a position of more knowledge and more competence, even if it's a child spectator. So I don't know at what point in child development the reading of the clown mask moves from being something that's fearful and frightening and unnatural to something that we learn is funny. But I think it is a learned behavior. And I don't think I have an answer to that question, but it's something that I have been thinking about. And I don't know if it's the same in Indian circuses, but in the Western tradition, the circus clowns' makeup, the face that they get, is copyrighted. Sometimes it's passed on, as in a, say, Japanese kabuki, the kind of makeup that you have can be inherited or gifted you from a famous clown. But normally you devise your own. It's a signature. You own that face and nobody else can have it, which is, again, quite an interesting wrinkle, I think, on what the clown's face represents.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is from Sakia Harris. There might be many children who got attracted to the circus world, seeing its glamour, adventure, and enthusiasm from the outside, but later got into the trap and abuse of this place. Do you think that the lack of societal respect is the reason that many teens tend to continue the circus torments despite the desire to explore the outer world?
I don't know whether we're talking here about real behavior or the life of the mind. I think very often the fictional works that I've read, particularly the young adult and crossover novels, I think they're almost always using the circus as a kind of metaphor, sometimes for adolescents. I think very often now for the kind of boundary between the realities that we inhabit, with many people spending a lot of time in alternative worlds like the computer games and augmented reality, virtual reality, that sometimes we don't know where the real and the manipulated and created is. And I think that adolescence is a time when you often are testing these things and where you fit into the world. But if you have multiple worlds, which is your reality? Are you more invested in the artificial world than in the world of everyday consensus reality? I think that these fantasy circus stories for older readers are often exploring precisely that boundary. And so they really are about the way that an adolescent or a teenager might be testing the self against the world's both real and artificial nowadays.
Thank you, ma'am. Our next question is from Elsa Lalu. In India, there are lots of talented people performing dance, circus, etc. Here, I just want to concentrate more on dancers where people want a typical body form to dance. This applies to circus too. Ma'am, my question is, today also such kind of discrimination exists. Can we say that this discrimination lineage can be traced to these circus and other dance forms and the books that propagate it?
Well, I don't think it's exclusive to books. Let me say that. I think it's something that I find interesting about books, because when you read a book, you are drawn into a position where you're kind of experiencing some of the things that go on. So you have a very close relationship with what's there. But the body type, the kind of body sculpting and control that you're talking about goes on in athletics, for instance. It goes on in figure skating. It goes on in many disciplines. And that is part of what makes trainers pick out children as exceptional. It also is why certain children who are very talented are told that they can't be ballerinas, or they can't perhaps do classical dance because they have the wrong body type. It is if we think that we want to preserve certain kinds of classical traditions and they've always been associated with a particular body type, I don't see how we get beyond that in the arts except for by creating alternative companies. So we now have companies where larger or older or heavier kinds of dancers dance, but they aren't in your classical companies. In the circus, I think you have something slightly different, because there has always been that tradition of the exceptional, extraordinary body, not always in a beautiful way, but in the grotesque. You know, we don't have them anymore, the sideshows, where sometimes called freak shows, where you would have three-legged children and two-headed calves and skeleton men and pony boys. We don't exhibit bodies that way anymore, but that kind of sense that the circus was a place where those people found a way to live and to make a living and to get a certain kind of fame that was a bit more protected perhaps than we're saying about children, because if you were a sideshow that made money, your owner would at least make sure you were kept alive, whereas you might have been allowed to die in the outside world. Again, I'm not sure I've answered that question, but it's I hope so.
Well, thank you, ma'am. There's time just for one more question, and we'll be reading a few responses. Last question is from Thomas sir. He has asked, W.B. Yeats' poem, Circus Animals Desertion, is another case in point about animals in circus. He seems to be also suggesting that vitality and the intimacy between the animals and their trainer. Your thoughts?
Yes, that's another work that is going to feature in a chapter, probably the same chapter as Hard Times, because of course the desertion of this circus animals also represents the desertion of kind of the imaginative impulse, the ideas, the creativity, maybe the myths and legends and ballads. All of these things are no longer working, and so that suggests then that the circus and its animals and its performers are part of the vital world, of the creative world, of the transforming and positive world. So that poem preys on my mind quite a lot, and I'm hoping that the title of my book will owe something to it in the end.
Thank you, ma'am. Now it's time for one response. It's from Albina Stephen. Nowadays, films and series are the more relevant and used medium than circus. And we have many films and series that portray children in a sexualized manner. The latest example being the controversy around the Netflix film Twerking. So can't we see that these kind of studies should be extended to these fields, and thereby it will be more relevant in current circumstances with enhanced technology and reach for even small kids who can sit and watch all these within the four walls of their home and get a wrong picture of things?
I think it is possible, and I think that is exactly the, I know this was an observation more than a question, and I think that observation aligns with the thinking that I was doing here, is that if something gives you, if you're reading or watching an image of something that makes you think that it's delightful and glamorous and exciting and attractive, and that you wouldn't mind working hard in order to have those skills, and yet beneath that, you're putting a child at risk. I think that it is something that we have to be aware of or cautious about. I wouldn't want to say that these stories shouldn't exist, because often they do have a cautionary element. Where I find them disturbing is when it is hard for the child reader to detect the caution or the need to be alert or vigilant in the tale.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. We have got a lot of questions, but unfortunately we do not have the time, so it's time to wind up. And we ensure all the participants that we will be forwarding these questions and it will not go unanswered. Well, it's time to wind up. Now I would like to invite Professor Vimal John to deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you, Dan. And as we conclude and say goodbye after this fascinating lecture on childhood circus stories and its rather controversial dimensions, I'm reminded of this quote by Marcel Proust: "Adolescents who last long enough are what life makes old men out of," he observes. And therefore, in a sense, perhaps we never really outgrow childhood. But he also goes on to say that of all realities, old age is perhaps that of which we retain a purely abstract notion the longest in our lives. But I believe that this is equally valid for childhood as well, owing to our increasing distance from those memories and those experiences. And therefore, it's a fascinating thing that opens up a range of possibilities for engaging with, although vicariously, the idea of childhood. Thank you so much, Professor Reynolds, for this wonderful lecture. It was a pleasure listening to you. I offer you our gratitude and thanks on behalf of St. Berkman's College and all the participants here who undoubtedly benefited from your readings and your insights. My thanks also to the head of the department, Professor P.J. Thomas, and the coordinators of the event, Mr. Nitin Verghese and Mr. Anish K. Joseph, for their passion towards bringing the academy and its debates and ideas closer to the community at a time when we desperately need both more human contact and more engaged scholarship. A big thank you to our hosts, Dan and Nina, who are doing a splendid job, and without whom this would have been a lot harder to organize and execute. So thanks, Dan and Nina. And finally, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope you will join us again on the 25th of September, when Dr. Aparna Nanda will talk about the possibilities of research in ethics and historiographic metafiction. Thank you once again. Please be safe. Bye.
Thank you, sir. We have now come to the end of our fourth lecture of our international webinar series. So feedback forms will be provided in the chat box. Please do ensure you fill them accurately for your e-certificates. So it was a pleasure to have you all among us today. So thank you and have a good day ahead.
And thank you, Dan and Nina, and thank you again, Nitin, for the invitation.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.